Okay, so welcome everyone and good day everyone to our F.U.N International Webinar Series. I would like to express my warmest thanks to all of you for taking your time off to join us today. And we wish to welcome Prof. Emeritus Tan Sri Omar Abdul Rahman. He is the founding president of Academy of Sciences Malaysia and senior fellow. He is a passionate proponent of science policy. Thank you, Prof, for joining our webinar. Okay, so the purpose of this series is actually to provide a medium for entomologists to share and exchange views related to entomology. Entomologists from all across the globe will be invited to share their findings with the participants of this webinar. Before we get started, I would like to inform you that this session will be recorded, and if you are refused to be recorded, you can watch this session in our YouTube channel, F.U.N Ento Lab, and the link will be shared in the chat box. And I have some important announcement before we start the talk. First one, please fill in the attendance form that will be provided for each certificate. Second, please mute your mic while the presentation is ongoing. And lastly, you may type in your question in the chat box and we will address them after the speaker has completed her presentation. So the topic that will be discussed in the current webinar is entitled Science Policy in the US Federal Government, which will be presented by our guest speaker, Dr. Meaghan Pimsler. Before we proceed with the talk, I would like to invite Nurul Azmira binti Zamri, our program coordinator for this current webinar, to introduce the speaker. Please, Azmira.
Yes, thank you, Adila. Hi, Dr. Meaghan. Happy birthday. And thank you for coming here. It is great to finally see you in person, although virtually. And previously, Dr. Meaghan and I, along with Dr. Hugh and Dr. Mariana, has worked together for almost, I think, 2 to 3 years to publish a review of mites at various localities in Malaysia. And finally, we got it published under the Journal of Entomology, Medical Entomology in 2020. And it was really a great experience for me. So to get started on the introduction, Dr. Meaghan received her Bachelor of Science in Entomology in 2007 from Cornell University. She further pursued her PhD in Entomology from Texas A&M University, where I think she and Dr. Hugh shared the same lab at that time. And then she became the Entomological Society of America Science Policy Fellow and U.S. Department of Agriculture National Institute of Food and Agriculture Postdoc Fellow. Currently, she is working under the American Academy for the Advancements of Science as Science and Technology Policy Fellow at National Institute of Justice in the United States Department of Justice. And which I think she is the perfect speaker for our topic of today. So far, she has published 19 peer-reviewed papers and 2 peer-reviewed book chapters. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Meaghan Pimsler. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I will be talking about science policy in the U.S. federal government, and I'm sorry to say that there won't be too much entomology in this presentation. So what I will be talking about today is, because you're not from the United States, it would be silly to expect you to know how the U.S. federal government is structured and how it functions. So I'm going to review that. I'll also be talking about the federal budget process and how decisions are made about how to spend money and where money will be spent. Next, I will talk about what science policy is and how it functions at the federal level. And then I will end the presentation talking about my experience with science policy with the Entomological Society of America and the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, in which I will talk a little bit about the structure of the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Institute of Justice, which is a part of that. And I will very briefly sort of describe some of what I do. I do speak quickly, really sorry, but I hope that there will be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So the U.S. federal government structure and function. So according to the United States Constitution, there are 3 parts of the U.S. federal government that are co-equal, which means that no part of the federal government is more powerful than the other part. They're meant to balance each other out. The legislative branch Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, are the group that makes laws and decides how money will be spent. The executive branch, headed by the US president, and then underneath by the vice president and the cabinet members, are the group responsible for executing the laws. So they're the people who carry out the laws. And then the judicial branch, mostly the Supreme Court, but other federal courts, interpret the laws. So to get a little bit more in the weeds, because this does matter when we're talking about science policy at the US federal government, the legislative branch has several responsibilities. They draft proposed laws, which then have to be signed into law. So they're actually called bills. And when they are signed by the US president, after both houses of Congress vote to approve them, then they become a law. They also confirm or reject presidential nominations. So the president has the power to say, I would like for this person to be the head of the Department of Justice, or I would like for this person to be a US Supreme Court justice. And they can decide whether or not they will approve that. Congress is the only body of the federal government that can declare war, and Congress controls the purse strings, which means Congress controls how much money is being brought in and what that money is being spent on. So they make the financial decisions. Congress, or the House of Representatives, has 435 people right now. And the number of people from each state depends on how many people live in that state, which is why it's called the House of Representatives. So if you live in a state with very few people, you will have very few representatives. And the Senate has 2 senators per state. And because there are 50 states in the United States, there are 100 senators. And so the idea is that the senators, the Congress people allows for the majority to get their voice heard, right? If most of the people in the United States select representatives that support a particular kind of law, then that law can be passed. But because the Senate is 2 people per state, this prevents the majority, in theory, from drowning out the voices and needs of minority groups in the country as well. So the Senate is meant to help balance that out when it comes to making laws. The judicial branch has the job of interpreting the meaning of laws, applying those laws to individual cases, and deciding if laws violate the Constitution. Judges are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and once you have accepted and been confirmed as a judge, that is a lifetime appointment. You will serve in that position until you choose to retire, or you die, or maybe you get nominated to another court, so some other position, and you choose to accept that. The highest court in the land is the US Supreme Court, which has 9 judges. Mostly what they do is make decisions about whether or not laws are acceptable according to the Constitution. But there are many ways to interpret the Constitution, so sometimes there's disagreement amongst the justices. There are 13 circuit courts, which are the level just below the Supreme Court, and there are 6 to 29 judges per court. They mostly deal with appeals or special issues, such as patent laws, right, where somebody says, I own this intellectual property and this person is trying to steal it, or other issues like that. And then below that, the circuits are broken up into additional district courts, which do general trial courts. So for the most part, they are responsible for overseeing cases where the US federal government is in a legal dispute with somebody or something else. It could be a business, it could be an individual. So this can be companies that maybe break the rules and are going to be fined for, say, releasing pollutants into the environment. Could also be somebody commits a crime and they are being tried at the federal level instead of at a different level in the United States. The judicial branch also contains the Federal Judicial Center, which is the research and education agency of the judicial branch. So they do research about the courts, i.e., how are judges making decisions, what kind of people are coming through the criminal justice system or other courts. They do analysis about policies and procedures. Then there's research for the courts, and this extends into education for the courts. So in the United States, judges make the decision about whether or not something can be considered scientific evidence for a particular court case. It is the judge that makes that decision. And so if a judge doesn't know things about science, a judge could make a decision about whether or not to accept something that isn't scientifically accurate. A rather infamous case that I know about is where somebody had poached a deer. So they killed a deer when they were not supposed to do so. And they had collected the meat and taken it home. And scientists were able to find DNA from the deer on the remains of the carcass, in the person's vehicle, the meat in the person's fridge, in the person's refrigerator, and also on the knives. And so they were discussing in court about how they did a DNA test, and they were able to show that the meat, that all of these things had the same DNA profile. They were all consistent with each other, and that all of this was a chain of evidence, right? That they were all connected. And the judge interrupted the expert witness and said, "Are you trying to tell the court that deer have DNA? Everyone knows that deer do not have DNA. The jury is instructed to ignore this." So that's the kind of thing that can happen if judges don't know about science and how it functions. And so one of the important things that the Federal Judicial Center does is produce this reference manual for scientific evidence. And so this discusses all of the different sciences that often make an appearance. What are some important new discoveries that judges should be aware of that may affect their court proceedings? What are some things that maybe science has discovered are no longer accurate or should no longer be included that once were? And this is available for judges to look at if they want to learn more about a certain kind of evidence or a certain kind of expert witness that is being considered. Now, this document is only released specifically for the federal judges, but judges at other levels, like the state level or the city level, can also use this document to take a look at it. And currently, this document, they are preparing to release a new one. So you'll notice this is from 2011. It was probably written in 2010, so it's at least 10 years old, right? The third edition. So they're currently working on a new one because science has progressed. The executive branch, the job is to carry out and enforce law. The president is elected to a 4-year term along with their vice president, and they make a lot of the decisions. But the executive branch is the largest branch of the federal government because it includes the cabinet, it includes all of the executive departments like the Department of State, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, a number of independent agencies, boards, commissions, and committees. And so the executive branch is the largest branch in terms of number of people and the amount of money that gets spent there, because they have to spend that money. Those people are necessary to enforce and carry out the laws that have been passed by Congress and signed into law. The US president in particular has some very specific roles that are assigned to them. They are the head of state, which means that they perform ceremonial functions as like a chief diplomat. So they welcome other heads of state, they negotiate and sign treaties. They're also the head of government or the chief executive, which means they decide what they think is important and what they want people underneath them to prioritize. Because some of the laws are not written so specifically that it isn't required. Like often the laws are so vague that the executive branch has to interpret what they may mean and figure out how to turn something like, look into the effect of coming out of prison on women who have been imprisoned. Now, what does that mean? How do you do that? What kind of information are you interested in? And those are the kinds of things that have to be decided by the executive branch in order to carry out this job assigned to them by Congress. And so the president sets agendas, makes decisions about what can, would, or should happen. And so that means that when a new president comes in, often there is an interruption or a change in priorities of what gets funded for research, or what kinds of regulations are enforced, or what regulations get rewritten, because the president can set the agendas. He can do this through executive orders, presidential proclamations, and presidential memoranda, all of which have different levels of what's called force of law, i.e. how much they must be followed. Some of them are more like, here's a thought that I just wrote down in my journal. Other ones are basically, you must follow this or you can lose your job. They are also the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, which means they get to make decisions about how the U.S. military is used. Although I want to reiterate, Congress is the only group that can declare war. And then they can also finally, and I think this is relevant to justice, grant reprieves and pardons. So a reprieve is something like, you're guilty. We all know that you're guilty. But I think that since you've already served 5 years in prison, I'm going to let you have a reprieve from the rest of your sentence. You don't have to stay in prison anymore. A pardon is a bit more involved and sort of vacates the conviction, so that person is sort of no longer guilty, if that distinction makes sense. So the U.S. federal budget process is really important for people interested in science policy because money is really part of what we're talking about, right? As I maybe should have reorganized this, but when I talk about science policy, one important part of science policy for a government is making decisions about where the money goes and what the money goes into and how much money is available to sort of support a research agenda that supports your country's needs and priorities. So in the United States, about a year and a half before the budget would go into effect, departments and agencies tell their department heads, tell the cabinet, here's what we want to work on. Here's what we think it's going to cost. This is based on these things. And these all go to the White House. So then the White House has an office that's sort of part of the White House called the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, that looks at all of these requests and also what priorities the president has and makes a budget, a recommendation that is going to be passed to Congress in step 2 for how much money should be given or set aside for each of the federal agencies. So this is the point at which the department may want a certain amount of money, but the president may say, no, I don't think that you deserve that much money. Or the president may decide that a group needs more money than they've asked for. And so that's step 1. Departments and agencies say, here, this is what we need. The president and the Office of Management and Budget decides if they agree with any of it or none of it. Famously, I'll say, is that some of the previous president's budget, President Trump's budgets, often cut the amount of funding that would go to research agencies like the National Science Foundation, which is a basic science research funding agency in the United States, by 40% or more. And so because there were certain aspects of the functioning of the federal government that he did not prioritize, he would ask for less money for those because he didn't think they needed money because he didn't think they were important. And so that's one of the ways that science policy can be significantly affected by presidential priorities. Next, the House of Representatives and the Senate read what the president has suggested, and then they come up with what they think is the amount of money that should be spent. Now, in both of these parts of the House of Congress, there are individual committees for individual questions. So there's a committee on agriculture that makes decisions about the kind of funding that will be spent on research or other things related to agriculture, growing food, animals. There's defense, there's House and Human Services for things like welfare programs, food programs, and things like that. So all of these individual committees make decisions about what they think based on the president's budget. And when President Trump asked for less money to be cut, the House of Representatives and the Senate disagreed with him and actually increased funding by 10% over the previous years, instead of going along with what he requested, which was a decrease in funding by 40%. So they may or may not choose to agree and follow the president's recommendations. And so then these two groups have to get together and discuss and figure out what are the differences between their bills and how they want to resolve those differences. So there are two documents that agree with each other that are moving through the process. Then Appropriations Committee, so that's the budget, Appropriations makes decisions about where the money will actually go. And this can be really complicated, but this is also the place where if you are an advocate for science funding, you would want to talk to the people who are either in charge of appropriations in general. So for example, currently, Senator Shelby from the state of Alabama is the chair of the Appropriations Committee, which has several subcommittees. So if you had a pet issue or a pet agency that you really wanted to talk about and to get more support for, this is, well, really you want to go before appropriations because they'll be too busy to talk to you when this is happening. But those are the people that you want to talk to about getting more money. Now, another thing is people who are employees of the federal government in the executive branch, it is illegal for them to go to somebody in the House, to go to somebody in Congress and directly ask for money. That is absolutely illegal. They will lose their job and they can go to jail. So they are not allowed to ask for funding or support for their stuff. So the only way that they can get that message is to hope that it goes through the president and makes it through the budget request. So then both chambers will vote on these bills and to make a decision. And if they have the same version, then it goes to the president to get signed. Now, if it's not signed by the 30th of September, because that's when the fiscal year ends in the United States, then there's no money set aside for this coming year. Ideally, what everyone wants to happen in the perfect world is that all 12 subcommittees, everyone agrees fast enough that they're able to submit all of those bills together in one chunk. So it's one single bill in each house that they vote on. But that never happens. And so often they'll pass things called continuing resolutions where they agree to spend the same amount of money for the next couple months while they make a decision about these bills that they haven't finalized yet, or they'll pass certain bills in sections while they work on other ones that they don't agree on. But when the federal budget process doesn't go well, i.e. when they can't agree or when committees can't make a decision or when the president refuses to sign it, the federal government shuts down. And there are very few people who still get paid and who can still work. So when this happens, the government services stop. Now, the things that people think about are the U.S. parks close, or you can't get a passport, that the IRS doesn't do tax refunds. But if you're a research scientist in the federal government, you are not allowed to go to work. You are not allowed to take care of your research animals. You are not allowed to answer emails, work on papers, or do anything work related. And so the last time I have personal knowledge of scientists who worked for the federal government whose research colonies of animals died because they were not able to get someone to take care of them because the government shut down. And usually each agency or area has only a small amount of money for like one person to come in for a half day every other day to take care of as many things as they can. So, you know, for some people, that means that their research is gone and there's nothing that they can do about it. And it also means that if you have a partner, if you are, say, working at a university and you have a partner at a government agency, they can't work with you. They can't answer any questions. They can't answer any emails. They can't write any papers with you. I heard stories, but I don't know that this is true, that some people have seen federal shutdowns coming and have moved all of their, say, research colonies to a university partner so that those people, their partners on the project, can keep the animals alive and keep the research going. But without a budget, it can be really serious for researchers who work for the federal government. All right, we talked federal government. I'm sure it was just interesting. So what is science policy? So science policy has to do with the allocation of resources for science, usually towards the goal of best serving the public interest. It can also include something called evidence-based policy, where governmental rules and regulations are informed by science, and that's how we make a decision. So one could think about, with the pandemic, decisions about wearing a mask, hand washing. How do we talk about that with people? That's an example of evidence-based science policy, right? Because you want to have the best scientific understanding in order to move forward. In the United States, this falls into primarily knowledge production and the role of knowledge networks. So that means funding scientific research, funding the careers of scientists or encouraging and supporting those, and translating scientific discoveries into technological innovation. So these are what the United States primarily prioritizes at the federal level in terms of science policy. Science-informed laws and regulations, as I've already mentioned. So there's some basics, there's some science philosophies that matter when we talk about these things. And this can make a big difference if I want to go talk to somebody about science policy. What do they care about, and how do I talk to them about it? So basic science attempts to stimulate breakthroughs. These are research questions. How does this thing work? Or why is this thing important? So if you work with insects, it might be, what kind of insects visit human remains in a city? Or how are these pest insects attracted to my plant that I'm growing? Those kinds of questions can also be more basic ecology questions, or questions in, really astrology, astronomy, etc. Applied research has to do with solving a problem or using the thing, right? So how can I have a problem with insects on my plant. How do I solve that? Or how can I use my knowledge of how insects develop at a certain rate depending on the temperature? How can I use that knowledge to help solve crimes? Right? So these are the kinds of examples that are applied research that are different than basic science. So what is going on is different than how can I use this new knowledge that I have. Another thing to think about is utilitarian versus monumental science policy. So utilitarian prioritizes the reduction of suffering. How does this thing that I am doing help the most people? And so for that, right, we may be interested in growing the most food or developing a vaccine. And then there's what's considered monumental. I like to call it curiosity for curiosity's sake. So these are questions that maybe don't help anybody, right? Like they're not going to help solve some problem, but they're interesting. We're curious about them. Like, how does this beetle have what are the structures of the cuticle that make this beetle have an iridescent thing? Or an experiment that I one day hope somebody will do is how big, so theoretically, right, insects are small nowadays because there's less oxygen in the environment that there was during the Jurassic period. Can I experimentally evolve insects in a high oxygen chamber to make them bigger? Now, there's no utility to anybody if I figure that out, but it's interesting. So that would be this sort of monumental kind of science. I personally think both are important, but you may want to consider who you're talking to. What do you think they may prioritize? Because how you choose to craft your message about whatever you're talking to them about should take into account not only what you think is important, but what they think is important so that you can communicate most effectively with them. And then the last one that is pretty important in the United States is scholastic conservation. So basically, we want science to be for everyone, and we want to make sure that we make this science available to everyone. So it prioritizing using existing knowledge, not losing it, and finding new ways to apply it. So things in scholastic conservation could be outreach activities that you do. It could be, you go to a school to teach kids about what your science is or how to do science. Or maybe you invite an elected representative or somebody from the government to your research laboratory to see what you're doing. In the United States, this also takes the form of what are known as land land grant institutions. And so basically this is money from the federal government that goes to one university in every state to help that state fund research and support STEM needs in their state. Most land grant institutions focus on agriculture because growing food or trees or other things is very important really to everybody in every state. But different states may have different needs. So in Alabama, there could be a lot of research on timber because growing wood is an important export for the state, whereas maybe for California, it's more focused on large monocrop agriculture or corn or whatever. So each state has their own university, and these universities also do a lot of outreach. They are the universities that have a specialized component whose job, it's called extension, and their job is to help translate scientific findings for the farmers, for the pest management professionals, for the law enforcement officers, for the people of that state who need science but maybe can't read a technical scientific paper. They help bridge that gap between them to make sure that the science is available to anyone that needs it and to help them figure out how to use it effectively. Okay, so some examples at the US federal government of science policy. In Congress, it may be budget decisions to fund major science agencies. So the amount of money they give to groups like the National Science Foundation or the United States Department of Agriculture. It may also be bills by Congress to support or start specific programs. So a couple of years ago, Congress said that pollinator health, native pollinator health, is something that we think is very important. So they set aside extra money that could only be used for pollinator health research. And part of the reason that they did that was because of activities of advocates who went and talked to them about why these things are important, why they should be concerned, and why research should happen. More recently, a bill was passed that helps support the CDC Centers of Excellence and that other bills that focus on vector-borne diseases. So the Zika virus pre-COVID pandemic was a big issue of concern in the United States. A lot of extra money was given to the Centers for Disease Control, which is the federal agency that oversees sort of like investigating epidemiology in the US, to help found centers of excellence or multiple places, these facilities in the United States, to help integrate information from different researchers in different states to help address region-specific needs, right? Because you can imagine that the US is a big country, and so not every state or not every area will have exactly the same needs. And so what this bill does is make sure that the money that was set aside will not go to waste, because now Congress is suddenly concerned about COVID, and so let's take all the money away from vector-borne diseases and only focus on this thing, because at least the United States has only so much money. And so sometimes when a new thing comes along, we really focus on that. And then because we are no longer protecting ourselves against, say, the vector-borne diseases, we'll have a resurgence in some new thing. And then, so that's special issues as they arise, right? Congress, there may be an individual, there are several individuals who are very concerned about Lyme disease, which is a bacteria that's spread by ticks in the United States. And it can cause long-term illness for people if it doesn't get treated. And there's some extra money that they want to have set aside so that people can do research on tick-borne illnesses, things like that. At the judicial level, science policy may be related to what scientific technologies and approaches can be used by the courts. I don't know how much American movie media you consume, but there's a movie called My Cousin Vinny. I want to be clear here, it is a fictional story and it is meant to be humorous. So if you watch it, don't think that everything is serious. But there is a part in the movie where a woman is asked to convince the court that she does know a lot about cars. And so her opinion about this thing about cars should be trusted. And that is a great example of the Fry standard, which was basically, I just had to convince the court I totally know what I'm talking about. And I could be considered an expert witness, and my testimony, whatever evidence I submitted, a judge might consider that as acceptable. Nowadays, the Doe-Bear standard has become the federal rule, and many states are adopting it as well. And what this does is focus less on the actual scientist and more on the technique and technology. So it has to have a known error rate. It has to be generally accepted by the scientific community that's relevant. We have to know what the sources of error are, right? Like what causes us to have different answers. So that's the kind of thing that science policy is. Also, patent litigation. So in the United States, if you have an idea, especially for some sort of chemical or maybe a technology or a structure or whatever, you can submit a patent. And if it is approved, what that means is anybody who uses that same approach, that same chemical, that same technology for commercial gain has to give you money for it, right? Because you own that idea. It can also be technology to assist the functioning of the court. So in the United States, a lot of court proceedings moved to virtual. So that's a kind of science policy. How do we choose to integrate technology into the way that our courts function so that people can attend from other places? And the thing that I find really interesting, another example, is the use of artificial intelligence in organizing, advising, or predicting. So there are many states that have artificial intelligence programs based on previously people who have previously gone through the criminal justice system to suggest, for example, whether or not a judge should allow someone to go out on bail, or what sentences would be appropriate, or whether or not this person should be allowed for parole. And you know, depending on the kind of data that goes in, and this is for any kind of data, right? This is for my own data that I analyze. Garbage in, garbage out. And so if I don't do a good job managing my database, the kind of data that I analyze, and making sure that I understand my data well, that can mean that my results are meaningless, or perhaps even actively harmful, depending on what they're used for. Another example of science policy in the executive branch is making granting decisions. So NSF, or the Defense Advanced Research Program Agency, also known as DARPA, these are the people who fund just totally out there stuff like, you know, one of the famous things was, can we make a cockroach a remote control thing? Can we like integrate technology with the neurophysiology of the cockroach such that we can control where the cockroach goes and what it does? There's technology development. So in the United States, 5G wireless technology, global positioning satellites, and internet were all initially funded as federal government programs that have now made their way out into use in other ways. And I'm sure that there are examples of that in Malaysia. Regulations, so regulations around genetically modified organisms, pesticides, pollution, all of those things are examples of science policy. And enforcement, right? So the executive branch includes the Department of Justice, or the Environmental Protection Agency. So investigating violations, assessing and collecting fines, or making sure that people are following the rules, prosecution in the courts. These are all science policy decisions, because at any stage in the game, the executive branch, at any level, somebody could make a decision not to follow through on something, right? And that's an example of science policy. Choosing to follow through and enforce or not are both science policy. All right, so who am I, and why should you care about whatever I have to say about science policy? So relevant, I'm going to talk about my experience with the Entomological Society of America first. This is a huge entomology. It's the largest entomological professional organization in the country, possibly in the world, but I don't want to like step on any toes. But there are at least 7,000 active members. That goes all the way from people with bachelor's degrees or who are students, all the way up to people with PhDs. It includes pest control professionals, people who work in academia, in government, in industry, who work at, you know, the Butterfly Museum, whatever. All of these people are included. And so they have a science policy fellowship, which is a 2-year commitment. 5 people per class are accepted. In the spring, you are brought to Washington, D.C., and they set up meetings to go meet with senators and senator and representative offices. So my years, I would have usually 6 to 7 meetings a day for like 6 days. I'd go to like 30 meetings, and each meeting is with somebody from a different state where I'm trying to tell them, this is what entomology is, this is what entomology can do for you, and this is what you can do for entomology. And so for me, I always felt that it was really important to think about in advance, what are some of the entomological issues that will matter to this person because of where they're from or what their background is? So for some places, I might talk about how important understanding insect populations can be for people who grow their own food, right? Because that was a state where there are a lot of people who grew their own food. Whereas for another person, maybe they're a senator, I know that they were a lawyer at one point. So I'm going to talk about entomology in the courts and how entomology can matter, because what I want to do is get them interested in the science of entomology and be supportive of continued federal investment in the science of entomology. In the fall, you again are brought to DC and you meet with people in the executive branch. So we would meet with people at the EPA or the Office of Management and Budget, or we also met with people from nonprofit and other advocacy groups to talk with them about science policy. And so this is a place where we could act as another kind of bridge between the people who are federal employees, right? Like somebody who works for an agency that may need more funding for something, you know. As an ESA science policy fellow, if I'm not a federal government employee, I'm allowed to say, man, you know, Meaghan over here in this agency is doing really great work. I hope you keep supporting that. And so these kinds of meetings can also be important for science policy. So I served as a science policy fellow from 2017 to 2019. I went to all the meetings. I met with tons of representatives and their aides and people in various aspects of the federal government. But this is an add-on, right? This is only something that you do a couple times a year for like a week at a time. And so I really wanted to get a little bit more into it. And so after I finished my tenure as a science policy fellow, I was selected to be a representative committee member of the Science Policy Committee for ESA. So this group is made up of elected and appointed members, and what it does is support and create, it supports, creates, and advocates for the priorities of the Entomological Society of America as a whole, what the grand challenges are. So basically, entomology, bugs don't respect political borders, and therefore there are issues that cross political borders that entomologists can be key in developing collaborations to help deal with. And so the 3 grand challenges that ESA is prioritizing right now are vector-borne diseases, invasive species, and sustainable agriculture. It may also be policy initiatives, either within the Entomological Society of America or that we advocate for at the federal level. Position statements. So sometimes, for example, should this particular chemical no longer be regulated? We might want to write a position statement on that because we feel that it should. Or maybe, you know, so that's the kind of thing that a position statement would be. The Science Policy Committee also helps develop partnerships and coalitions, like with pest management groups or epidemiologists or the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, those kinds of things. And finally, provides training and opportunities for science advocacy for members of ESA. Although honestly, a lot of the stuff, the infographics are freely available online. And if you thought that they would be helpful for you in talking to, I'm sorry, I should have done more research on the structure of the Malaysian federal government. For you and talking to your government officials about science, you know, you could probably use them. So for example, This is, don't read this all. I'm not trying to get you to read it all. But what I'm trying to show you is that the ESA Science Policy Committee has identified a hierarchy of issues. Some issues we are active in. These are the things that we think are super important, and ESA will always put time into it. So we're concerned about loss of biodiversity. We're concerned about scientific integrity, etc. And it also includes some actions that could be done. There are engaged issues and watched issues. And these things change over time, right? As issues change, as some things start to feel more important versus others, etc. This is freely available online. I'll leave my contact information up at the end and you can ask questions. So what I'm currently doing is I am a science, so I'm with the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. I'm so sorry, I formatted it in PowerPoint and now I'm presenting it on Google Hangouts and I guess I didn't check this slide well enough. So the AAAS is the organization that publishes the scientific journal Science. You may or may not have heard of it. I don't know. They're also actively involved in science advocacy. They do a lot of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics career support. They analyze the federal science budget. They do a lot of stuff related to diversity and inclusion, public engagement, science diplomacy, science policy development, and they have the Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program. And the goal is to connect science with policy by fostering PhD holding scientists and helping them get embedded in the federal government such that they can engage with policy making. Some people will go serve in the congressional branch or the judicial branch. Most serve in the executive branch. So maybe you're helping develop regulations or helping make funding decisions and that sort of thing. I personally am within the U.S. Department of Justice. Here is an outline of the entire U.S. Department of Justice. So the U.S. Department of Justice includes lawyers. The Attorney General is the highest lawyer in the land. It includes law enforcement groups like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the U.S. Marshal Services, and it has a research component, which is part of the Office of Justice Programs in the green box. And so the Office of Justice Programs provides federal leadership, grants, training, and technical assistance to the criminal justice systems in the United States to improve our capacity to prevent or reduce crime, assist victims, and enhance the rule of law. So the whole goal of OJP is to help make sure that we have less crime, people are taken care of, and that the rule of law is being followed. OJP has a bunch of different subgroups. The Office of Justice Assistance, which helps local criminal justice programs. Maybe it helps get them money to improve their resources or so they can start moving things online. The Bureau of Justice Statistics is the statistical agency, and they do all the analysis on like patterns of crime and things like that in the U.S. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention focuses specifically on dealing with juvenile crime and juvenile delinquency and juvenile victimization and how we can deal with that. The Office for Victims of Crime specifically is focused on making sure that victims get what they need. And then the Office of Sex Offender, et cetera, I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. And finally, the National Institutes of Justice. So it's a little tiny part of this much larger part of the federal government. So the motto of the NIJ is to strengthen science and advance justice. And so what that means is they are the research, development, and evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. And their goal is to understand crime and justice issues through the application of science. They provide objective knowledge. They help primarily focus on the state and local level of law enforcement in the United States because the U.S. federal government has a lot of infrastructure in place already to support criminal justice at the federal level. And so there are several smaller offices within the office. The Office of the Director of the NIJ is a politically appointed position. And then all of these other groups have different things that they work on. The two that are probably most interesting to you are the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences. So they focus specifically on forensic science. They are funding forensic science research in the United States. So they provide money to help develop new techniques, to understand questions that we have, to develop new technology, to figure out new ways to share data, all specifically related around forensic sciences, explicitly and specifically. Whereas the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Technology is more of a criminology side of thing, understanding the kinds of factors that help that influence whether or not an individual or a group of people may act in a criminal manner, whether or not certain kinds of interventions help reduce crime, whether or not programs that we put in place are actually effective. Like maybe I have a really great idea and everyone agrees with me that this is totally going to reduce the number of people stealing milkshakes from the whatever. But when we test it, right, this research, evaluation, and technology are the group of people who might provide funding to test whether or not it actually works, you know, actual statistical empirical evidence. And so those kinds of things are used to help support criminal justice in the United States. I'm not supposed to talk too much about it, but I can tell you, what do I do? So what I do is help write solicitations, which are the documents that the federal government releases to invite people to apply for a grant. So I help in the development of those. I am not responsible for them, and I do not have final say, but I may help provide my feedback on what things I think are important or not. I may help develop new programs. So if there's an area of research that the NIJ is not currently involved in, but maybe it should be, I work with other people at the NIJ to help develop that, to get more information out there, to investigate whether or not that would be useful. I advertise existing programs. So a lot of people in the United States aren't aware of all the funding opportunities that the NIJ provides that could be relevant for them. There is a lot of money in the NIJ to fund graduate students, almost the same amount of money as the National Science Foundation has, but they don't have nearly the number of applicants. But they could, right, if people knew about it. So there's, I also help analyze data for partners. So if they have some sort of data and they want to know, like, what does this say? Tell me what I can understand out of this. I help do that. I also help develop training and teaching materials to give to law enforcement groups or crime lab groups or to lawyers, that sort of thing. I help support my colleagues. So if they have things that they're working on and they need assistance, I provide that. And I'm also involved in reviewing programs. So for example, an area of research that I have expertise in is forensic entomology, the application of the study of insects to criminal matters. And the NIJ has funded a lot of research in that area. And so the question is, what has the NIJ gotten out of that? What are the major findings from all this research that they've funded? So that could be a kind of like review that I might do, right? Like read all of the papers, read all of the research, and come up with a summary of the major findings of the last 10 years of forensic entomology research supported by the NIJ. So in conclusion, the U.S. federal government has 3 distinct branches. Science policy is varied, and it really is only limited by your imagination. So anything that you want to advocate for with your science, any kind of science policy, that's almost certainly science policy. But how you want to talk about your science and who you need to talk to for that depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And what I've done, advocacy, outreach, and science funding primarily. It's not the best conclusion because I really was kind of all over the place, but we have time for questions. I can stay later than the end of seminar if this can support that. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, follow-ups, please don't hesitate to reach out. It does not have to be about science policy. You know, if you're trying to get information about what it's like in the United States for something, or maybe you're going to go somewhere and you want some more information about a lab, or perhaps you're interested in finding a collaboration, please reach out to me. I would be happy to support you. If you have any questions specifically about the U.S. Department of Justice, but you can email at me at my U.S. Department of Justice email address. But if it is a question about anything other than specifically that, please email my personal Gmail account, okay? I may or may not be able to answer your questions about the U.S. Department of Justice because I do have to get approval to do that. And I want to be clear, everything that I've said here is my personal opinion. I do not necessarily represent the opinions of the National Institutes of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, or the U.S. federal government in any way. Okay, I'm going to be quiet. I will answer questions. I can stay as long as you guys want.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pimsler, for your impressive presentation. Now we will proceed to the Q&A session. So I will read some questions that have been posted in the chat room. Also, for those who want to ask questions to Dr. Pimsler directly, please do so by turning your mic on. We always welcome an interactive session. And our first question from E. Putra. I completed my fellowship at USDA Beltsville, Maryland in 2015. I noticed using that time, USDA was offering postdoc position for students to conduct research in their laboratories. May I know, is this application is open to foreign country like Malaysia, and can the subject of the research is focusing on the problem that we face in the origin country? For example, I am working on cacao insects in Malaysia.
So my understanding of USDA postdoctoral grants is that you have to be a U.S. citizen or green card holder. If you have a question about a specific job that you are interested in and you are having trouble understanding what the document says, I'd be more than happy to help you and look at it. Now, there are cases where they have international partners. I mean, the USDA is heavily involved in the sterile insect control program for the primary screwworm, which is maintained in Panama. And so there may be other programs like that. I suspect that your best bet would be to see if you can develop a collaboration with somebody in the United States such that they need a postdoc and the position can be written so that you are really the only person who could fulfill that position.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Before I read the question from Dr. Hyo, I would like to welcome the Vice Chair of Young Scientists Network of Academy of Science Malaysia, Dr. Manraj from UPM, and also to all the members of Young Scientists Network Academy of Science Malaysia who are with us today. So the question from Dr. Hyo Chongchin, Meaghan, is there any research grant from NIJ available for foreign institutions or researchers, especially in the field of forensic entomology?
So I suspect that my answer will be pretty much the same, which is you will at the very least require a federal partner in the United States who would really be the person that applies. Because the National Institutes of Justice is very focused on more local issues within the United States, it could be difficult to get funding for an international project from the NIJ. That is not to say it is impossible. You would have to look at the rules and guidelines, perhaps talk to the program officer. You can always reach out to them and ask the person who is in charge of managing the program that the grant is being funded through. You can ask them questions. There are other parts of the U.S. federal government that do explicitly and specifically fund international research outside of the United States, but the NIJ, to my knowledge, is not one of those places. There are some groups in the United States that are focused on supporting the criminal justice efforts in other places, but to my knowledge, they focus primarily on training for law enforcement rather than funding grants. It may be that they have money set aside for projects that they could use to fund a research grant, but they have not traditionally used the funds in that way. I have learned that when the budgets are being developed for many of these agencies, there's often a certain amount of money that they know needs to be set aside in case things arise that are an excellent opportunity or a thing that they didn't know might be an issue that they need to get involved in. So I don't know for certain, but I do not think. Now, I mean, again, if you had a partner in the United States and you could develop a project that you were a great fit to work with on it, you could probably sell it. And I suspect that it wouldn't be impossible to come up with projects where an international component was indeed required, right? Again, insects don't respect political borders. I think everybody knows that. So, you know, you may find that there is some leverage in that. I don't make granting decisions, so I don't know for sure.
Thanks, Meaghan. Thanks so much. Yeah.
And we have the final question in the chat. Hi, Dr. Pimsler. What is the process flow of establishing a new science policy in the US?
That's a really interesting question. So because I've mentioned science policy is a really broad topic, I'm not totally clear on what specifically you might mean by that. But in my example, right, like say I work for the United States Department of Agriculture, and I learned that people are really interested in farming insects for food, but we don't have any regulations in place about so we have rules in place, right, to like look for insects that shouldn't be coming into the United States, or that we don't want on our food, or that, you know, the only this many parts of insects can be in your can of tomatoes or whatever. Like we have those rules, but we have zero rules and regulations about what policies, what procedures need to be in place to safely farm insects for humans to eat, right? And so that could be something where I notice that that is a missing gap. We don't have any information about that. And that would be a place where a new science policy could be developed, because that's something that we don't have. You can also have a case where there's a new technology, right? Like genetically modified organisms is a pretty vague term, and it can mean anything from a transgenic organism to, you know, like a specifically crossbred thing. But depending on what different countries' interpretations of that term might be and how they feel about that, that can mean that a lot of diplomacy is required to talk between people who are involved in making these decisions, because that will affect trade, that can affect international partnerships, that can have a lot of other effects that you might not expect, because each country has their own priorities, their own preferences, and that needs to be discussed and developed. So that's another example of science policy. But, you know, it could be from the top down. The president says, we need this, work on it, people. Or it could be from the bottom. I've noticed that this is a gap. And when that happens, you have to explain in like a one-page document, be as convincing as you can with the least science terms that you can manage, what this problem is, why it matters, and what needs to be done about it. And then you give that to your boss and you convince them, and then they give it to their boss and they convince them, and so on and so forth. But you can also have, I mean, in the United States, you know, maybe I live in a place where they come and spray for mosquitoes once a week, and it's killing all the insects and not just the mosquitoes. And maybe I like to watch birds in my yard, in my garden outside, because all the bugs are dead, the birds have nothing to eat, and they're not there anymore. So I may want to go talk to my local health department and say, hey, you need to use a different chemical, or you need to spray less often or at a different time time of day. And I know that in the part of the United States where I live, a high school student managed to get a bunch of other people in our city to agree that this was important and talk to their representatives. And it totally changed the way the city controlled mosquitoes, just because a high school student thought that it was important. So, you know, there's lots of ways that that can happen. And if you have a pet issue that you want to work on, I don't know anything about the way the Malaysian federal government works, but I would be more than happy to talk with you about your issues. You could help me understand what kind of challenges you may have or who you think, and we can work on figuring out who you might need to talk to, what you think they would prioritize, and how to say your message in a way that specifically speaks to the thing that they think is important. I hope that helped.
Okay, we have Varatini Maraja who raised a hand.
Yeah, hi, happy birthday. Thank you for this informative talk, even though it's your birthday and all. I wanted to know, like, because you're an entomologist, so I think it's more on bugs and all. Like, on the other hand, I'm a forensic anthropologist, so I wanted to know, like, if this Department of Justice and everything in the US, it's also and the science policies are also applicable for different fields of forensic, as well as like the anthropological side, as well as the entomology. Like, that's all I wanted to ask about.
Yeah, no, very relevant, very important. I know forensic anthropology, actually, there's more money that goes towards forensic anthropology research than forensic entomology research in the National Institutes of Justice. So obviously, I think bugs are way better than people. So, you know, whatever, you're silly. But, you know, yes, any kind of science, because there are people who are criminologists, who are psychologists, who are all kinds of things, engineers, chemical engineers, right? And all of these people they have a STEM issue, they have STEM concerns, they have relevant knowledge. And whether it's from how do we get more people to join the field so that we can have a really strong forensic anthropology field here in Malaysia, to you know, what are the important findings from my research that maybe needs to affect the way that decisions are made or not made in my country or my state, you know? So yes, lots of stuff. I mean, one of so in a forensic anthropology context, this is a little of what's called a third rail issue. So in the United States, if there's like a subway train, there are usually two rails that the cars roll on, and the third rail is the highly electric rail that provides the power. And you don't want to touch that one. So I'm about to talk about something that is what's called a third rail issue, all right? So in the United States, people who are of European descent, who are white like me, we are not the initial colonizers of North America, right? The first people that were here were the native indigenous peoples, the Native Americans or First Nations people, depending on how you want to talk about it. And so in the United States and Canada, there are a number of rules related to especially anthropological and archaeological sites and how that relates to the native people. And so in some places, so science policy comes into play because certain remains or findings perhaps need to be returned to a tribe that they come from, or maybe a certain area can or cannot be used for development, like for houses or agriculture, once a set of remains are found on them, if it belongs to a member of one of these indigenous tribes. And so that can be really important. Forensic anthropology science policy here in the United States, and I hear a lot about it up in Canada as well. But you know, there are other things too. Fun fact that I learned about the United States, just so you know, I had a friend who was a forensic anthropologist for the state of Alabama, and it's called the Rules of Four. And so at a number, do you know about this already? Oh, okay. So, well, for everybody else, cemeteries in the United States, perhaps other places, for every one headstone that you find in your cemetery, there will be 4 bodies. So there are way more human remains. And this becomes a real problem, right? Like if you're trying to build somewhere and you need to move those remains, like you have to look all around the area. And then what do you do with all of them? So I found that fascinating. I had no idea. Oh, well, I'm happy to know that that's maybe not just in the United States, but.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, is there any more question for Dr. Meaghan? So, if
Well,
the
can I have asked maybe last question if there's
Sure.
no question from the others? Yeah, Meaghan. So sometimes the government will spend a lot of money on some mega scientific project, for example, space exploration that burns a lot of public funding. So as a scientist ourselves, sometimes we receive criticism or or questions from the public.
Oh yeah.
Questioning about this kind of mega projects. So how would you convince the people?
Well, again, it depends on who I'm talking to. For example, sometimes when I would go talk to a congressperson, they'd say, well, if you want more money for like funding about entomology, who am I going to take it away from? There's only so much money. I've got to take it away from someone. Secret, do not ever play that game. That is their job. That is not your job. You're just telling them why entomology is important. Their job is to figure out how to balance out all the priority ones. Do not play that game. But, for example, I think we're all familiar with next generation sequencing. At least we have a vague idea that there's this new way of working with DNA that allows us to sequence lots and lots of stuff at once. It's having a big effect in medicine and ecology and everything. Did you know that the foundation for that were astronomers at NASA developing analytical tools to analyze star fields, to identify planets, differentiate galaxies, find black holes. They developed computational techniques to analyze star fields, and that is the backbone for the way that these next generation sequencing technologies work, because they look for little pinpricks of lights and they analyze them. And so like, I would never feel comfortable knowing that. I would never feel comfortable suggesting that there couldn't be some great breakthrough down here on Earth or in some other field, knowing what big changes can happen from such unlikely places. And I understand that there's only so much money, and there can be a lot of concern about, are we spending it in a way that supports, that helps the most people, that is the most useful. And, I think that there are a lot of ways that understanding the world around us can help us develop ways to make the world better for everyone. And if we don't give ourselves the opportunity to think outside the box, to try new things, we're never going to find them. And so I think that the world would be a poorer place if we weren't able to understand it more and identify more of these things.
Right. Great answer. Thanks, Meaghan.
Yep, no problem.
So I think we have one final question from Jima Tajuddin. Hi, I'm in the field of pharmacognosy, trying to connect the relationship between plants, bioactive compounds, and insects. Is there any possible collaboration for me here?
I personally do not have any possible collaborations with you on my own. However, I know lots of people who do research science in the United States, including some people who are particularly interested in things like pollinator health and how that's affected by plant secondary compounds, or people who work in geometric nutritional frameworks, right? And they want to understand how nutrition is impacted by plant secondary compounds, or how insects may respond relative to plant secondary compounds. There's an entire DARPA program, which I think is still ongoing, which is specifically related to understanding the relationship between insects and plants. You may have seen some of the op-eds that were released in like Science or Nature, I can't remember, where basically there was talk about developing genetically modified insects and genetically modified plants such that if something were going to happen, like say we realized that a drought was about to happen, we could release our genetically modified insects out into our genetically modified plants, and the feeding activity of those insects would cause the plants to activate genes to make them more drought stress tolerant. I think that they've scaled back kind of what they're trying to accomplish now, but they are still interested in bioactive compounds in insects. So I personally don't have a collaboration for you, but if you are looking for US collaborators, reach out to me. Let's see what I can do. I know people.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pimsler, for your answers. I guess I can close this webinar now if there are no more questions due to time constraint. Don't forget to sign in the attendance form. For those who are interested to join us in the next webinar series, the date is set on 27th of August by Dr. Martin Hall from Natural History Museum in UK. And I am looking forward again to meet all of you in our next webinar. So again, I would like to thank Dr. Pimsler for agreeing to become our guest speaker for today. And to the participants who joined us, thank you. Stay safe and goodbye.